What if the most vulnerable moment of your life forced you to face the man who shattered your world? Janessa Monroe is in labor, her life about to change forever. But when she's rushed into the delivery room, she locks eyes with the doctor on call, her ex-husband, Marco Reed, the man who sacrificed their love for his career. As the storm of her past and the pain of the present collide, the doors swing open. A billionaire walks in, a man with the power to save or destroy them all. This isn't just a story about childbirth. It's about the collision of past betrayals, present power, and a future no one could have ever predicted. The first contraction hit Janessa Monroe like a betrayal. It was sharp, sudden, and 3 weeks too early. She gasped, her hand flying to the swell of her belly as she stood overlooking the Seattle skyline from the penthouse apartment that still felt more like a luxurious hotel than a home. Outside, the October sky had turned a bruised purple, the clouds churning over Puget Sound in a dramatic display that mirrored the sudden tempest in her own body. "Just Braxton Hicks," she whispered to herself, a mantra she'd repeated for weeks. But this was different. This had teeth. Her phone buzzed on the marble countertop. It was David. A picture of him, smiling on his yacht in the San Juan Islands, filled the screen. His calls were like clockwork, a comforting rhythm in the grand, quiet life he had given her. She swiped to answer, trying to keep her voice even. "Hey you," she said, forcing a lightness she didn't feel. "Just landed in Tokyo, my love." David Henderson's voice was warm, a low baritone that always managed to soothe her. "How are you and our little man doing? Is he behaving?" Another wave of pain coiled in her lower back. Janessa squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. We're fine. He's just kicking up a storm. Probably wants to be a soccer player." She hated lying to him, even a small omission like this. Their relationship was built on a foundation of serene honesty, a stark contrast to the fractured life she'd left behind. David was her safe harbor, the man who had seen the broken pieces of her and called them beautiful. He was stability, kindness, and a power so immense it was sometimes dizzying. "I'll be back in 48 hours. The moment I'm done, the jet is wheels up. I miss you both terribly." "We miss you too," she managed, her breath hitching. "Travel safe, David." She hung up just as a third, more insistent contraction seized her. This was real. This was happening. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Alone. David was on the other side of the world, and the storm outside was breaking, rain starting to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her hands shook as she dialed her doula, who confirmed her fears. "It sounds like early labor, Janessa. With the storm picking up, you should head to the hospital now. Don't wait." Her hospital bag was packed, sitting by the door of the nursery she had so lovingly designed. A room of soft greys and blues, with a hand-painted mural of a starry night sky. This baby, their son, was the anchor to her new life, the symbol of a future she never thought she'd have. The drive to Pacific Northwest General Hospital was a nightmare. The wind howled and the rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the city streets into slick, dark mirrors. Her driver, a stoic man named Arthur, navigated the treacherous roads with grim determination, while Janessa breathed through the escalating waves of pain in the back, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The hospital was her choice. It was the best in the state, with the most advanced neonatal unit. David had insisted on it. He'd made a significant donation just last year to fund a new maternity wing. The Henderson wing, they were calling it. The irony was not lost on her. They pulled up to the emergency entrance, and a team of nurses was there in an instant, helping her into a wheelchair and whisking her through the gleaming, sterile hallways. The world became a blur of bright lights, hurried voices, and the rhythmic beeping of machinery. "We've got a G1P0 at 37 weeks, presenting with regular contractions every 3 minutes, a nurse called out as they rolled her into a private delivery suite. Janessa's head was spinning. She felt out of control, a passenger in her own body. A calm, authoritative voice cut through the chaos. All right, let's get her settled and check her vitals. I'm the attending OB/GYN on call tonight. My name is Dr. Reed. The name struck Janessa like a physical blow. No, it can't be. The world seemed to slow, the noise fading to a dull roar in her ears. She looked up, her vision tunneling, and saw him. He was older, his dark hair tinged with silver at the temples, the lines around his eyes deeper. But it was him. The same intense, focused gaze, the same confident set of his jaw. He wore blue scrubs and a white coat, a stethoscope draped around his neck like a familiar accessory. It was Dr. Marco Reed, her ex-husband, the man who had told her she was a liability to his career. The man who had methodically and clinically dissected their marriage until nothing was left but scar tissue and resentment. And he was the doctor tasked with delivering her baby. Marco's eyes met hers. For a fraction of a second, the professional mask slipped. She saw it. The flicker of shock, the ghost of a memory, the dawning, horrifying recognition. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Janessa," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper, lost in the hum of the hospital room. For Janessa, the pain of the contraction searing through her was nothing compared to the agony of seeing him standing there. The past she had so carefully buried had just risen from the grave, and it was wearing a doctor's coat. The nameplate on his white coat read, Dr. Marco Reed, MD, FACOG. It was the culmination of everything he had sacrificed for, everything he had chosen over her. Seeing it now in this impossibly cruel twist of fate felt like a judgment. For Marco, the sight of Janessa Monroe, vulnerable, in pain, and breathtakingly pregnant in his delivery room, was like a phantom limb suddenly aching. He hadn't seen her in 5 years, not since the final sterile meeting in a lawyer's office where they had divided their meager assets and their once intertwined lives. He'd heard she'd moved on, remarried someone wealthy. He'd allowed himself a moment of smug satisfaction, assuming she'd found a comfortable life, a consolation prize. He had never imagined this. His mind, usually a fortress of clinical calm and precise procedure, was in chaos. He saw flashes of their past. Janessa, laughing in their tiny apartment, paint smudged on her cheek. Her tear-streaked face, the night he'd told her he couldn't come to her father's funeral because he couldn't get his residency shift covered. The hollow look in her eyes when he'd said, "A family, a child. It's a distraction I can't afford right now, Janessa. My career has to come first. You knew that." He had been ambitious, ruthless in his pursuit of excellence. He'd seen their marriage as a weight, her needs as an anchor, holding him back from the brilliant future he envisioned. He had convinced himself it was a necessary amputation for the greater good of his career. Now, that career had led him directly back to the woman he had discarded. "Dr. Reed," a nurse prompted, her voice pulling him back to the present. "Her blood pressure is a little high." Marco blinked, forcing the ghosts back into their cages. He was a professional. He was the head of obstetrics at Pacific Northwest General, a position he had fought tooth and nail for. He would not falter. "Of course," he said, his voice clipped and regaining its authority. He stepped forward, avoiding Janessa's wide, terrified eyes. "Let's get a fetal heart rate monitor on her." "Janessa," he said her name, and it felt foreign, like a word from a language he'd forgotten. "I need to examine you to see how far along you are." Janessa flinched as he approached, a silent, gut-wrenching rejection that hit him harder than any shouted accusation could have. She looked at the nurse, her voice trembling but firm. "I want another doctor." The nurse glanced nervously between them. "Ma'am, Dr. Reed is the chief of the department and the attending on call. With this storm, getting another OB in could take time." "I don't care," Janessa insisted, her gaze locking with Marco's. It was filled with a potent mixture of fear and a steely resolve he hadn't seen in years. The fragile artist, he remembered, had been replaced by someone stronger, someone forged in a fire he had started. Marco felt a flush of shame, hot and unfamiliar. He had the power here. He could insist, pull rank, cite hospital policy. The old Marco would have, But looking at her, at the raw panic on her face, he couldn't. "It's all right, Cindy," he said to the nurse, his voice low. "Page Dr. Evans, see if she can make it in. Until she gets here, however." He turned his focus back to Janessa, the professional mask firmly in place. "I am responsible for your care and the care of your baby. I will not let my personal history with you compromise that. I need to ensure the baby isn't in distress. Please, let me do my job." His words were measured, clinical, but they were a plea. He saw the conflict in her eyes. The terror of his presence was warring with the primal fear for her unborn child. After a long, tense moment, she gave a single, jerky nod. Her surrender was a blade twisting in his gut. He worked with practiced efficiency, his hands steady despite the tremor in his soul. His touch was impersonal, clinical, yet every second felt charged with 5 years of unspoken words and unresolved pain. He was acutely aware of the life growing inside her, a life that represented a future she had built entirely without him. "You're about 5 centimeters dilated," he announced, stripping off his gloves. "The baby's heart rate is strong. Everything looks good for now. Dr. Evans is on her way, but she's fighting through the storm. It may be an hour or more." He stepped back, creating a sterile distance between them. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, a steady, strong beat that was a testament to the new life at the center of their old wreckage. He found himself cataloguing the changes in her. The years had been kind. She carried a new confidence, a poise that wealth alone couldn't buy. This wasn't the woman who used to wait up for him with a reheated dinner, hoping for a few scraps of his attention. This was someone else, someone whole, and that, more than anything, was what undid him. He had told himself their divorce was for the best for both of them, that he had set her free to find someone who could give her what she wanted. But he had never truly believed it. In his arrogance, he'd always harbored a small, dark thought that she would be diminished without him. He was wrong. She had flourished. And as he stood there, the doctor in charge, he had never felt less powerful in his life. He was just a ghost in scrubs, a painful memory she was forced to endure on the most important night of her life. For the next hour, the room was a stage for a silent, agonizing play. Marco kept his distance, directing the nurses, reviewing charts, and speaking only when medically necessary. He could feel Janessa's eyes on him whenever he moved, a heavy weight of scrutiny and memory. He focused on the monitors, on the clinical data, on anything but the woman in the bed. He tried to picture her husband. He imagined some older, portly tycoon, a man who saw her as another beautiful acquisition. It was a comforting, dismissive image, one that soothed his bruised ego. The rhythmic beeping of the fetal heart monitor was the only constant, a steady counterpoint to the storm raging outside and the turmoil within. Janessa breathed through her contractions, her focus turned inward, her face a mask of pain and concentration. She had found her strength, drawing from a well he never knew she possessed. Then the doors to the suite swung open with a soft whoosh and a man walked in. He wasn't old or portly. He was tall and impeccably dressed, even in a haste-rumpled cashmere coat. His hair was a distinguished salt and pepper, his face etched with concern. He moved with an aura of quiet, unshakable authority, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. He went straight to Janessa's bedside, his eyes only for her. "I'm here, my love," he said, his voice the same warm baritone Janessa had heard on the phone. He took her hand, lifting it to his lips. "My pilot broke every rule in the book to get me back. Are you all right? Is the baby okay?" "David," Janessa breathed, a wave of relief washing over her face, softening the lines of pain. "You came." "I'd have walked on water," he said softly, stroking her hair back from her forehead. Marco watched the scene, feeling like an intruder. The tenderness between them, the effortless intimacy, was a stark, painful contrast to the clinical distance he had always maintained. This was what she had needed, what he could never give. David Henderson finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over the room and landing on Marco. His eyes, a sharp, intelligent blue, held no malice, only a calm, assessing curiosity. "You must be the doctor on call," David said, his tone polite but with an underlying edge of steel. He didn't offer a hand, just a nod. "David Henderson, I trust my fiancée and my son are receiving the best possible care." The name hit Marco with the force of a physical impact. David Henderson, not just a wealthy husband, the David Henderson, the tech billionaire, the philanthropist, the man whose name was plastered on museums, university halls, and most recently, the new state-of-the-art maternity wing of this very hospital. The Henderson wing, the wing Marco was the frontrunner to be the chief of. A cold dread washed over him. His entire professional future, the culmination of 2 decades of relentless ambition, was tied to this man, and this man was in a relationship with his ex-wife. The power imbalance in the room had shifted so seismically it left him reeling. "Yes, Mr. Henderson," Marco managed, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. "I am Dr. Reed. Everything is progressing as it should. The baby is healthy and Janessa is strong." He saw a flicker of recognition in David's eyes as he said his name, a subtle tightening around his mouth. David knew, of course he knew. A man like David Henderson didn't leave things to chance. He would have known everything about Janessa's past, including the failed surgeon in training she had once been married to. "Dr. Evans has been paged at Janessa's request," Marco added, feeling the need to explain, to justify his presence. David's gaze shifted to Janessa, his expression softening into one of pure empathy. "Whatever you need, my love," he murmured before turning his attention back to Marco. "Dr. Reed, I appreciate you making the necessary arrangements. However, until Dr. Evans arrives, you are in charge of the 2 most important people in my life. I expect you will conduct yourself with the utmost professionalism. Am I clear?" It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact, delivered with the calm certainty of a man who had never had his expectations go unmet. Marco was no longer just a doctor. He was a service provider being evaluated by his most powerful client. The weight of David's stare was heavier than any hospital administrator's review. "Crystal clear, Mr. Henderson," Marco replied, his professionalism the only shield he had left. The dynamics had been irrevocably altered. David Henderson's arrival had filled the room with an invisible, high-stakes pressure. He wasn't just a concerned partner. He was the patron, the benefactor, the king in this castle. And Marco, the ambitious chief of the department, was suddenly just a courtier, desperately trying to prove his worth while navigating the minefield of his own past mistakes. He watched as David coached Janessa through her next contraction, his voice a low, encouraging murmur. He placed a cool cloth on her forehead, his movements sure and comforting. He was present, completely and utterly, in a way Marco had never been. In that moment, Marco realized the full, crushing weight of his failure. It wasn't just that he had lost Janessa. It was that he had never even understood what it meant to have her in the first place. He had traded a treasure for ambition, and now he was being forced to serve the man who knew its true value. The hours that followed were the most grueling of Marco's professional life. Dr. Evans was stuck in a mudslide on the pass, unreachable. Marco was it. There was no escape. The delivery room, once his domain of absolute control, now felt like a cage. He was under the microscope, scrutinized by 2 very different yet equally powerful forces. There was Janessa, her pained, silent glances a constant reminder of his personal failings. And there was David Henderson, a quiet, formidable presence in the corner of the room, his watchful blue eyes missing nothing. David never interfered, never questioned a medical decision, but his stillness was more unnerving than any interrogation. It was the stillness of a predator, patient and observant. Marco's focus narrowed to a pinpoint. Every action, every word, had to be perfect. He was performing the most delicate of ballets on the edge of a razor blade. He called out instructions to the nurses with crisp precision, interpreted the squiggly lines on the fetal monitor with an almost obsessive focus, and reported his findings to Janessa and David in a calm, even tone devoid of all emotion. "The baby's heart rate is decelerating slightly during the peak of the contractions," he announced, his eyes fixed on the monitor. "It's common. It's called a variable deceleration, but I want to keep a close eye on it." "What does that mean?" David asked, his voice low and sharp. "It can sometimes indicate a temporary compression of the umbilical cord," Marco explained, refusing to be intimidated. This was his territory. "We'll change Janessa's position to see if that alleviates it. Nurse, let's have her lie on her left side." As the nurse helped Janessa turn, her gown shifted, revealing a faint, silvery scar on her shoulder. Marco's breath caught in his throat. He remembered that scar. She'd gotten it during their one and only vacation, a cheap trip to Mexico. She had slipped on some wet rocks while trying to collect seashells, cutting her shoulder. He had been annoyed, impatient, worried about missing their dinner reservation. He'd barely looked at the wound, dismissing her pain. Now, the sight of it was an indictment. Memories, unwanted and sharp, pierced his clinical armor. He remembered the arguments, always the same. Her wanting more of him insisting his work was too important. He'd called her needs unreasonable, her emotions a distraction. He had slowly, systematically starved their marriage of oxygen until it suffocated. "It's getting stronger," Janessa gasped, her knuckles white as she gripped the bedrail. David was instantly at her side, wiping her brow, murmuring words of encouragement. He was her rock, her anchor. Marco was just a functionary. The baby's heart rate dipped again, this time for longer. The calm, rhythmic beep became a more urgent, lower tone. "That's not a variable anymore. That's a late deceleration," Marco said, his voice sharp with command. The atmosphere in the room crackled with new tension. "It's recovering, but it's a sign the baby is under stress. The placenta may not be providing enough oxygen during the contractions." He felt David's eyes on him, a laser beam of paternal fear and analytical pressure. "What's the protocol, doctor?" David's voice was dangerously calm. Marco's training took over, a lifetime of drills and emergency simulations rising to the surface. "First, we provide supplemental oxygen to the mother." A nurse was already placing a mask over Janessa's face. "Next, we increase her IV fluids to improve blood flow. If the decelerations continue or worsen, we have to consider our options, which are an assisted delivery with forceps or vacuum, or an emergency C-section," Marco said, meeting David's gaze directly. He would not flinch. He would not show weakness. "Our primary goal is the health of the baby and the mother." Janessa looked at him from behind the oxygen mask, her eyes wide with fear. For the first time that night, she wasn't looking at her ex-husband. She was looking at her doctor, her fate and her child's fate in his hands. In that moment of shared fear, the years of bitterness seemed to dissolve, replaced by a raw, primal need for trust. He gave her a small, reassuring nod. "We're not there yet, Janessa. Your body and the baby are working hard. We're just being prepared for every contingency." He moved closer to the bed, his focus entirely on his patient. He was no longer Marco Reed, the failed husband. He was Dr. Reed, chief of obstetrics, and he would not fail at this. He placed his hand on her belly, feeling the tightening of the next contraction, his eyes glued to the monitor. "Okay, here comes another one," he said, his voice low and steady, talking as much to himself as to them. "Stay with me, baby. Stay strong." The heart rate dipped again. The line on the screen seemed to plummet in slow motion. The room was silent, holding its breath. 10 seconds. 15. 20. It felt like an eternity. Marco's own heart was hammering against his ribs. This wasn't just any baby. This was Janessa's baby. His failure to save their marriage was a scar on his soul. He would not, could not, fail to save her son. Then, slowly, the number on the screen began to climb back up. The beep returned to its normal rhythm. A collective, quiet sigh of relief went through the room. Marco let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Good recovery," he said, his voice tight. "But we can't sustain this. The baby is telling us it's time to come out. Janessa, you're fully dilated. It's time to push." He looked from Janessa's determined, fearful face to David's stony, anxious one. The microscope was at its highest magnification. The final act was about to begin. The next 30 minutes were a crucible. All the history, all the tension, all the unspoken words in the room were burned away by the raw, elemental urgency of childbirth. There was only the singular, focused goal. Marco was no longer a man haunted by his past. He was pure function, an instrument of medical science. His voice was the steady, commanding metronome in the room, guiding Janessa through the waves of pain and effort. "That's it, Janessa, you're doing perfectly. Take a deep breath, and on the next one, give me everything you've got." David was on her other side, a mirror of Marco's focus, but fueled by love instead of adrenaline. He held her hand, his thumb stroking her skin, his voice a constant stream of loving encouragement. "You're so strong, my love. Our son is almost here. You can do this." They were two men from different worlds, bound by their past and present connection to this one woman, working in an unlikely, unspoken partnership. One provided the technical skill, the other the emotional strength. Janessa was a warrior. She channeled every ounce of her being into the task, her face flushed, her body trembling with exertion. In her grunts of effort and gasps for breath, Marco heard the echo of a strength he had never recognized, a resilience he had mistaken for fragility. "I can see the head," Marco announced, a surge of adrenaline sharpening his senses. "Just a few more, Janessa. You're so close." He worked deftly, his hands sure and steady, guiding the baby's head, preventing a tear, clearing the airway. It was a procedure he had done 1,000 times, but this time it felt sacred. He was welcoming a new life into the world, a life that was a direct consequence of the life he had destroyed. It was a strange, painful, and profound penance. With one final, powerful push and a cry that was a mixture of agony and triumph, the baby was born. A tiny, slippery, perfect human being entered the world with a sudden, shocking silence. For a heart-stopping second, the only sound was the frantic panting of his mother. Then Marco cleared the last of the fluid from his mouth, and the baby let out a lusty, furious wail. The sound broke the tension in the room like a thunderclap. It was the most beautiful sound Marco had ever heard. It was the sound of life, of victory, of a new beginning. "He's here, Janessa," Marco said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He carefully placed the crying infant onto her chest. "He's perfect." Janessa sobbed, tears of joy and exhaustion streaming down her face as she looked at her son for the first time. She touched his tiny, wrinkled cheek, her expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. "Oh, hello there," she whispered. "Hello, my sweet boy." David leaned over, his own eyes shining with tears, and kissed Janessa's forehead, then the baby's head. "He's beautiful, Janessa, just like his mother." He looked at his son, his powerful, guarded features collapsing into sheer, unguarded love. The billionaire vanished, and in his place was just a father, overwhelmed by a miracle. Marco stepped back, his job done. He became invisible, a technician fading into the background as the sacred, private moment of a new family forming unfolded before him. He watched them, Janessa, David, and their son, a perfect, complete trinity of love and joy. And in that moment, a profound, aching loneliness settled over him. It was a loss deeper than he had ever felt. It wasn't jealousy. It was a hollow, echoing realization of the magnitude of what he had thrown away. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the chance for this joy, this connection, this meaning. His entire career, the countless hours, the missed holidays, the sacrificed relationships, it had all been a race to a finish line that he now realized was empty. He had become the chief of obstetrics, a respected surgeon, a man at the pinnacle of his profession. But he was an outsider looking in on the one thing that truly mattered. He had delivered Janessa's baby. He had saved him from distress and brought him safely into the world. It was perhaps the most important thing he had ever done as a doctor. But as he stood there in his scrubs, watching the woman he'd let go embrace the family he'd denied them, he felt like he hadn't saved a thing. He felt like he had just witnessed the full extent of his own damnation. A nurse patted his arm gently. "Good work, doctor." He could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. He quietly slipped out of the room, leaving the happy family in the warm glow of their new life, and walked into the sterile, empty hallway, finally, utterly alone. 2 hours later, after the whirlwind of postpartum procedures had settled and Janessa had been moved to the best private suite in the Henderson wing, Marco knew he had one final duty to perform: a routine postnatal check. It was a task he could have easily delegated to another doctor, but he knew he couldn't. He owed her this at least. He needed to face her one last time without the chaos of childbirth as a buffer. He found David Henderson standing in the hallway outside her room, speaking quietly on his phone in Japanese. When David saw him, he ended the call and met Marco's gaze. The cool, assessing look was back. "Dr. Reed?" David said, his voice a low rumble. "Mr. Henderson, I need to perform a final check on Janessa. Make sure her recovery is proceeding as expected." David was silent for a long moment, studying him. "She's sleeping. Her son is in the bassinet next to her. Be quiet." It was an order, not a request. He stepped aside, allowing Marco to pass. Marco entered the room. It was more like a luxury hotel suite than a hospital room, with soft lighting and a view of the city, the storm having passed. Janessa was asleep in the bed, looking peaceful, the lines of pain erased from her face. In a bassinet beside her, the baby slept, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, reassuring rhythm. He performed his checks with practiced quiet, taking her blood pressure, noting the data on his chart. He was about to leave when a soft voice stopped him. "Marco!" He turned. Janessa was awake, her eyes open and clear, watching him. The exhaustion was there, but so was a new kind of serenity. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said quietly. "You didn't," she replied, her voice soft but strong. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they carried a universe of meaning. It wasn't just thanks for delivering her baby. It was an acknowledgement, a release. "I was just doing my job," he deflected, the default response of a man uncomfortable with emotion. "No," she said, shaking her head slightly. "It was more than that. I was scared. You were calm. You were the doctor I needed you to be. Thank you for saving him." He moved closer to the bed, drawn by a force he couldn't resist. The professional barrier between them had finally crumbled. "He's a beautiful boy, Janessa. You did all the work." They fell into a silence that was no longer awkward or tense, but filled with the weight of years. "Why, Marco?" she asked, her voice a near whisper. "Why did you do it, to us?" The question was not an accusation. It was a genuine, weary inquiry, the question she had probably asked herself 1,000 times in the lonely years after he'd left. He owed her an honest answer, not the clinical, self-serving excuses he had given her back then. He sank into the visitor's chair by her bed, the starch seeming to go out of his white coat. He looked at his hands, the hands that had delivered her son. "I was a coward," he said, the admission costing him everything and, in a strange way, nothing at all. "I was terrified of failing, not just as a doctor, but as a husband, as a father. I saw it all as a zero-sum game. Every piece of me I gave to you, to us, felt like a piece I was taking away from my career. And my career was the only thing I thought I could control, the only thing where I thought I could be perfect." He finally looked at her. "I defined my worth by my success, and I defined success as my job title, my reputation. You, our marriage, it was complicated, it was emotional. It required a part of me I wasn't willing to give because I was scared I didn't have it. It was easier to amputate it than to face my own inadequacy. Tears welled in Janessa's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. I wasn't an amputation, Marco. I was your wife. I loved you. I would have supported you through anything. All I wanted was for you to see me, to choose me, just once in a while. I know, he whispered, his own voice cracking. The shame was a physical weight pressing down on his chest. I see that now, tonight, watching you with him, with your son. I saw everything I threw away, not just you, but a whole life, a real life. I have a career, Janessa. You have a life. I never knew the difference until tonight. He stood up, feeling raw and exposed. I am so sorry for everything, for the man I was, for the pain I caused you. It was unforgivable, but I am asking you to forgive me anyway, not for me, for you, so you can be free of it. Janessa looked at the sleeping baby beside her, her expression softening. She reached out and placed her hand on her son's chest, feeling his tiny heartbeat. I already am, she said softly, looking back at Marco. He freed me, David freed me, but hearing you say it, it closes the door. Thank you for that. It was absolution, a quiet, gentle closing of a chapter that had haunted them both. Marco nodded, unable to speak. He gave one last look at the baby, at the woman he had wronged, and at the new life she had built from the ashes of their old one. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door to her new life firmly, finally, closed behind him. The next morning, Marco received an email. The sender was David Henderson's executive assistant. The subject line was simply, meeting. The body of the message requested his presence at Mr. Henderson's downtown office at 4 p.m. It was not a request. Marco spent the day in a fog. He performed his rounds, consulted with colleagues and signed off on charts, but his mind was elsewhere. He was replaying the events of the previous night, the raw honesty of his conversation with Janessa, and the impending dread of his meeting with the man who held all the cards. He expected to be fired, or if not fired, to have his name quietly removed from the running for chief of the Henderson wing. David had every reason to want him gone. He was a painful reminder of Janessa's past, a ghost at the feast of their new happiness. Marco had made his peace with it. After last night, his career ambitions felt hollow anyway. At 4 p.m., he stood before a sleek, minimalist skyscraper that housed Henderson Industries. He was escorted to the top floor, to an office that was larger than his apartment, with a panoramic view of the city and the sound beyond. David Henderson was not sitting behind his massive desk. He was standing by the window, looking out at the view, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. He turned as Marco entered. "Dr. Reed, thank you for coming," he said, his tone neutral. He extended one of the glasses to Marco. "I find a good single malt helps to clarify the mind." Marco took the glass, his hand surprisingly steady. "Mr. Henderson." "Please call me David," he said, gesturing to a pair of leather armchairs. "Sit." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the city below. Marco waited. He would not speak first. "I've reviewed your professional record, Marco," David began, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "It's impeccable. You're widely regarded as one of the best obstetric surgeons in the Pacific Northwest. Your name is at the top of the list for the leadership position in the new wing." Marco simply nodded, waiting for the but. "Janessa told me about your conversation last night," David continued, his gaze direct and piercing. "She said it gave her a sense of peace, a closure she didn't know she needed." This surprised Marco. He had expected anger, recrimination, not this calm, analytical dissection of their emotional landscape. "I'm glad it helped her," Marco said honestly. David took a sip of his whiskey. "When I met Janessa, she was fragile. She was like a brilliant painting that someone had tried to scrape clean, leaving behind only faint traces of color. The person who did that, you, had convinced her that her own vibrant, wonderful, chaotic colors were a flaw. My primary job for the last 3 years has been to help her see that those colors are her greatest strength. Marco felt a flush of shame. He had no defense. It was the truth. "I don't hate you, Marco," David said, and the statement was so unexpected it jolted him. "I've spent my life analyzing systems, finding points of failure. Your marriage was a system, and you were its primary point of failure. You were a brilliant technician who was a catastrophic failure as a human being." He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "But last night, in that hospital room, I saw both. I saw the brilliant technician who saved my son's life. And in the hallway afterward, I saw a flicker of the human being, the one who finally understood the cost of his mistakes. The question is, which one are you going to be from now on?" Marco was floored. This wasn't a dismissal. It was a test. "I don't know," Marco admitted, the truth raw and unvarnished. "Last night changed me, what I want, what I thought was important. It all seems different today." "Good," David said with a decisive nod, "because I'm not going to have you fired. In fact, I'm here to offer you the position, Chief of the Henderson Wing." Marco stared at him, speechless. "Why?" "Because the wing needs the best, and you are technically the best. But more importantly, because I believe in the power of redemption, and I am giving you a chance to earn yours," David explained. "You will run my wing. You will dedicate yourself to bringing new life into this world. And every time you do, you will remember what is truly important. Not the prestige, not the title, but the life itself. You will remember my son. You will remember Janessa." He stood up, placing his empty glass on the table. "This isn't a gift, Marco. It's a burden. It's a daily reminder of what you lost, and a chance to ensure no one in your care ever suffers because of a doctor's arrogance. The job is yours, if you want it." It was a masterful move, both magnanimous and cruel. David wasn't just giving him a job, he was sentencing him to a lifetime of remembrance, chaining his ambition to his penance. He was giving Marco exactly what he'd always wanted, but forever tying it to the memory of his greatest failure. It was power, wielded with surgical precision. Marco looked out the window at the hospital in the distance. He thought of the tiny baby he had delivered and the quiet strength of his mother. He could run, leave this city and this history behind, or he could stay and live with the ghosts and try to become a man worthy of the forgiveness he'd been given. "I accept," Marco said, his voice clear and firm. A month later, Janessa was sitting in the nursery, rocking her son, Oliver David Henderson, in her arms. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The room was her sanctuary, filled with the soft, milky scent of her baby and the quiet hum of a happy, settled life. David came in and knelt beside her chair, stroking Oliver's soft cheek. He looked at Janessa, his love for her a tangible presence in the room. "How are my two favorite people?" he asked softly. "We're perfect," she said, smiling. Her heart felt full to bursting. The trauma of the birth had faded, leaving behind only the profound, fierce love she felt for her son and the man beside her. There was a soft buzz from the front door intercom. David checked his watch. "Ah, that should be him." Janessa looked at him, confused. "Him who?" "Just something I had to take care of," he said, giving her a reassuring smile before leaving the room. A few minutes later, there was a tentative knock on the nursery door. It opened, and Marco stood there. He wasn't wearing a doctor's coat, just a simple sweater and slacks. He looked hesitant, out of place. In his hands he held a small, elegantly wrapped gift. "Marco?" Janessa said, surprised. "David invited me," he explained, his eyes not on her but on the baby in her arms. I wanted to bring something for Oliver." He stepped forward and placed the gift on the changing table. "I hope you don't mind." "Of course not," she said, her voice gentle. He finally looked at the baby, a genuine sad smile touching his lips. "He looks like you," he said quietly. "He has your eyes." An awkward silence fell between them. It was David who broke it, stepping back into the room. Marco was just telling me he's officially accepted the chief position, David said, his tone casual. But Janessa could see the underlying meaning in his eyes as he looked at her. She looked at Marco, searching his face. The old arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility, a weariness that seemed to have settled deep into his bones. "Congratulations," she said sincerely. "You deserve it. You're a brilliant doctor." "Thank you," he said. He met her gaze, and for the first time there was no history between them, only a shared understanding. "I know what this job is. It's not a prize, it's a responsibility." David made that very clear. He looked at David, a flicker of something, respect, gratitude, maybe even fear in his eyes. Then he turned back to Janessa. "I won't let you down," he said. The "you" was ambiguous. It meant the hospital, it meant David, but most of all, it meant her. It was a promise to honor the lesson she had taught him. He didn't stay long. He said his goodbyes and left, the interaction polite, civil, and blessedly free of drama. The ghost had finally been laid to rest. After he was gone, Janessa looked at David. "You gave him the job. He earned it," David said simply, coming to stand behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "And I believe people can change. He has a long road ahead of him, but his journey is his own. Ours," he said, leaning down to kiss the top of her head, "is right here." Janessa leaned back against him, her gaze falling on the gift Marco had left. Later she would open it. It was a first edition of Goodnight Moon, a simple, timeless classic. Tucked inside was a small card. It didn't say congratulations or best wishes. It just said remember what matters. She closed her eyes, holding her son tight. She was surrounded by love, in a home built on second chances. The storm was over. The sky was clear. And for the first time in a very long time, Janessa Monroe was completely and utterly at peace. In the end, it wasn't about the billionaire's power or the doctor's ambition. It was about a woman finding her own strength and two men being forced to confront the true meaning of their lives. Janessa, Marco, and David's story shows us that our past doesn't have to define our future, and that redemption can be found in the most unexpected moments. It's a reminder that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in love, forgiveness, and the courage to start a new chapter. If this story of betrayal, love, and second chances moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional tales that explore the deepest corners of the human heart.